The clock struck midnight, marking the beginning of another long shift. James, the night security guard at Blackwood Industrial Facility, leaned back in his chair, staring at the grainy security monitors. The building was vast, abandoned except for the occasional creak of settling metal beams. He had done this shift 100 times before, but tonight felt different. A low, static hiss through his radio, a sound he had not heard before. He tapped it, adjusting the frequency, but the static only grew louder. Then, buried within the noise, he swore he heard something, a whisper. He sat up straight, eyes scanning the screens. Camera 4B flickered, distorting for a moment before settling on an image that sent a chill down his spine. A shadow stood in the hallway, motionless. James reached for his flashlight. The night had just begun. James rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. The night was always quiet here, too quiet, but tonight the silence felt suffocating. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio. He reached over and adjusted the volume, but the static was louder than usual. His fingers hovered over the control panel when the lights flickered. He froze. For a split second, he thought he saw something move in the corner of the screen, but when he rewound the footage, it was just the usual blur. Maybe it was just fatigue, he told himself. He'd been pulling night shifts for weeks now and was overdue for a rest. Still, there was something about the facility tonight. Something felt wrong. Suddenly, the motion sensors triggered. A loud, sharp beat pierced the stillness. James looked at the monitor and saw a red blip on the security feed. Something had moved in the restricted section. His eyes narrowed. No one was supposed to be there. The section had been locked for weeks, after the last worker had been removed for safety violations. He grabbed his flashlight and made his way down the dim hallway, each step echoing through the emptiness. As he approached the restricted area, the temperature seemed to drop, and his breath turned visible in the cold air. A strange chill crawled up his spine. James paused before the door, hesitating. The keypad showed that it was secure, and yet the motion sensor had gone off. He pushed the door open with a heavy grunt, the door creaking as it moved. The room beyond was dark, the faint glow from his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. He scanned the room, empty. There was no sign of anyone. He turned to leave, but just as he did, the door slammed shut behind him, the metallic clang echoing like a warning. James whipped around, his heart racing, but there was nothing. The room was still silent, yet it felt as though it was pressing in on him. He quickly reached for the door handle, but it refused to budge. The radio on his belt crackled again, and through the static, a voice whispered his name. James. His hand froze. That wasn't possible. There was no one else here. James' pulse quickened as the voice on the radio continued to whisper his name. His fingers trembled around the flashlight, which he gripped harder, as though the light could fend off the shadows closing in around him. He gave the door another tug, but it remained locked tight, as if something or someone was holding it shut. James. The voice again, the same distorted whisper, but this time it felt closer. He spun around, expecting to see someone standing in the dark corner, but the room was empty, except for the piles of old files and forgotten office equipment. James' mind raced, but one thing was clear. He had to get out of this room. He needed to regain control, and quickly. He slammed his shoulder against the door, using all his weight, but it refused to open. Something wasn't right. His eyes darted back to the room. There in the far corner was the faint glow of the security monitor, still showing footage from the facility's cameras. It was a low-resolution feed, showing various hallways and rooms, but the flickering image caught his attention. Camera 4B was on again. This was a camera that had glitched earlier, showing that shadowy figure. As James stepped closer, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, he noticed something strange. The figure was still there. It wasn't moving, just standing motionless in front of a large steel door, the archive room's door. But that was impossible. There couldn't be anyone inside. This section had been sealed off for years. Suddenly, a low creaking sound echoed through the room, as if the door were slowly opening. But James hadn't touched it. He hadn't even been near it. Instinctively, he took a cautious step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as if the building itself were reacting to his fear. Then, just as he turned to run, something caught his eye, a piece of paper fluttering in the corner. James hesitated. It was a document, the edges ragged and torn, as though it had been yanked from a file and left behind. Curiosity gnawed at him. Despite the growing terror in his chest, he leaned down to pick it up. The faded text on the page was hard to read, but one word stood out to him in bold, black ink. Warning. Before he could examine it further, the lights flickered violently, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. He tried to steady himself, but his hands were shaking so violently that the flashlight slipped from his grip, rolling under a nearby shelf. Now he was plunged into darkness, silence. Then a sound broke through, the unmistakable creak of a door opening behind him. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, James turned. There, in the dark corner of the room, the door to the archive room was ajar. It shouldn't have been, but it was. And then he heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. Someone was inside. James stepped back, his mind racing for an explanation, but nothing made sense. The door had been sealed. The room was locked. And yet, something or someone was there. The footsteps stopped just behind him. He could feel the air move, a presence so close he could almost reach out and touch it. James, the voice whispered again, this time right behind him. James froze, his heart leaping into his throat as the voice whispered in his ear. So close he could feel the breath against his skin. His body went rigid, the fear coursing through him like ice water. He couldn't move, couldn't even speak. His mind was a whirlwind of panic, but his legs felt like lead, as if the dark presence behind him had somehow paralyzed him. The air was thick, suffocating, with an eerie chill creeping over his skin. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head, half expecting to see something monstrous looming over him. But there was nothing, just the inky blackness of the room. James' breath came in shallow gasps. He reached for his flashlight, desperately fumbling for it on the floor, his hand shaking so violently that it felt as though his fingers weren't even his own. Finally, his fingers brushed against the cold metal, and he snatched it up, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the room in stark detail, but it showed nothing but empty shelves and scattered files. His chest tightened. He wasn't alone. The voice had been so clear, so real. It had come from behind him, and yet, when he turned around, no one had been there. Was he imagining things? Was it the isolation getting to him? No! He wasn't imagining it. Something was here. He turned to face the hallway once more, but this time his eyes caught something in the reflection of the glass door. It was barely visible at first, just a faint outline, like a shadow in the corner of his eye. But as his eyes focused, the shape began to sharpen, A face. A face staring at him from the other side of the glass. It was not his own. The face was gaunt, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight into his soul. The features were distorted, twisted, as if the person had been trapped in the glass for far too long, slowly decaying over time. Its lips were cracked, twisted into an expression of agony or warning. But what struck him most was its eyes, empty, black, and void of any light. They seemed to pull him in, like dark holes trying to swallow him whole. James' breath caught in his throat. Was this a reflection? He moved closer, eyes fixed on the glass, unable to tear himself away from the sight of that face. His pulse quickened, each beat thundering in his ears as he leaned forward. But as he approached, the face didn't move. It remained perfectly still, watching him. Then, in a sudden jolt, the reflection flickered. Just for a split second, the face in the glass was now smiling, a smile so wide, so unnatural. It stretched beyond human limits. James staggered back, his breath erratic, his heart pounding in his chest. The smile didn't fade, it grew. And then the smile spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was deep, distorted, but unmistakably clear. It wasn't just a whisper now. It was a command. James stumbled backward, his feet tangling with the clutter on the floor. The flashlight slipped from his hand and rolled away, leaving him in complete darkness. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs refused to move. His mind screamed one word: escape. But it was already too late. The face in the glass wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. James snapped his head around, eyes darting between the security cameras and the eerie stillness of the facility. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the chilling events that had unfolded over the past hour. Every corner of the building felt oppressive now, as though it was closing in on him. He had heard whispers, seen shadows move where no one should have been, and the overwhelming sense of dread had only grown. Then a realization hit him. The other guards, there should have been 3 of them on shift tonight, yet there was only James. The others had disappeared without a trace, and the security logs showed no record of them leaving. They had simply vanished. James tried to contact them through the radio, but all he got in return was a barrage of static and distorted whispers, the same voice that had called his name earlier. It didn't make sense. The building's layout flashed through his mind. Empty corridors, abandoned rooms, and rooms that had never been used. Where could they have gone? Why hadn't anyone noticed? The unanswered questions clawed at his sanity. He checked the cameras again, his eyes scanning each room. In the distance near the back exit, something caught his attention. A figure, barely visible through the grainy footage, standing motionless. The guard was still there, but it was not one of his colleagues. The figure was unfamiliar. His heart raced. The guard's face was distorted, too pale, and there was something wrong about the way the figure moved, slowly, with jerking motions, almost like it wasn't human. James couldn't breathe. He wasn't alone anymore. James stood frozen, his breath shallow as the low hum of the building echoed around him. The security room, dimly lit by the flickering monitors, had become a place of unease. The distorted figure on the camera feed was still there, motionless, its pale form like a shadow cast on the grainy screen. His hands gripped the desk tightly, nails digging into the wood. It wasn't a glitch. He had seen that figure before. The figure that didn't belong in the facility. The figure that had haunted him since the moment he stepped into his first night shift. The building felt colder now. The air seemed to thicken with an unnatural presence, pressing against him, making it harder to breathe. He glanced around the room, half expecting to see something lurking in the corners, but the space was still too still. James tried to shake off the growing sense of dread. He wasn't alone anymore. He couldn't ignore it. His fingers trembled as he reached for the radio, the static on the other end sending a wave of unease through him. He spoke, but his words caught in his throat. There was no reply. The usual reassuring voice from the other guards, the sound of their shifting and muttering, was gone. He was alone, completely alone. Where did they go? The lights overhead flickered again, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally across the walls. James looked back at the cameras, eyes desperately scanning the screens for any sign of the others. But there was nothing, just empty rooms and cold hallways. A sudden sound from behind him jolted him out of his trance. The door to the security office creaked open, and before he could react, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The chill seeped into his bones, numbing his hands, his feet. No one had entered the room. James spun around, his pulse racing, but there was no one there. He turned back to the monitors, and that's when he saw it, a shift in the image. Camera 4B had been showing the back exit earlier, but now it was different. A figure appeared in the corner of the frame, standing in the hallway. The feed flickered again, the figure's face now visible. James' breath hitched. The face was distorted, twisted, like something unnatural. It didn't look human anymore. And yet, he knew that face. He stepped back from the desk, his heart pounding louder now, the walls pressing in. The figure on the screen smiled, a smile that stretched far too wide. James didn't need to see more. He needed to leave. But as he turned to head for the door, he froze. The voice came again, his own voice, soft, whispering, almost a hiss, filling the room from all directions. Your shift has begun, James. The walls seemed to close in, the lights flickering and dimming once more. He turned back toward the camera. The figure, his reflection, now stood at the door of the security office, staring at him. It wasn't just a glitch. It wasn't just a reflection. It was him. But it wasn't. James stepped backward, his heart racing as the door slammed shut behind him. The building was no longer the place it had once been. This was a place of shadows, of horrors that he could never have imagined. His time was up. A new shift had begun, and he was no longer just a guard. He was a prey. The lights went out completely. The silence was deafening.